Peraí. Todos bem? Boa tarde. Mais um encontro do Taxidis. Vários convidados hoje, nossos amigos internacionais, e hoje recebendo o nosso querido amigo George Taxidis. Tudo bom, George? Espera aí. Vocês estão me ouvindo? Vocês estão me ouvindo agora? Antes não? Então tá. George, prazer te receber. Tudo bem? Vamos começar hoje com o George Taxidis. Vou fazer a tua apresentação formal, né? Nosso convidado de hoje, o George Taxidis, ele é membro da British Jungian Analytics Association e desenvolve sua prática clínica particular no leste de Londres, no Reino Unido. Ele é cofundador da Queer Social Dreaming Matrix, que se envolve de forma lúdica com os sonhos dentro da comunidade queer e da iniciativa queer internacional junguiana. Ele é professor associado na Goldsmith University of London, onde está envolvido em aconselhamento e treinamento em psicoterapia e estudos psicossociais. Atualmente, o George está escrevendo um livro sobre psicologia junguiana queer, que será publicado pela Routledge. Nós tivemos o prazer de conhecer, eu e a Luciana, e a Isa também, né? O George, ano passado, aqui em São Paulo, no evento do Instituto Freedom. Foi muito bom tê-lo conhecido pessoalmente, George. Depois você veio para o Rio, né? Foi visitar o Museu de Imagens do Inconsciente. Depois queria te ouvir um pouco sobre o que você achou. E é um enorme prazer te receber, George. É uma grande alegria você estar aqui conosco. Temos boas recordações das nossas conversas lá em São Paulo. Obrigado pela tua presença. Seja bem-vindo. A todos os convidados do George, eu conheço alguns, a Punita Miranda, a Valéria Kirbel, tudo bom, Val? E outros também, sintam-se todos bem-vindos ao Taxidis. Obrigado. Contigo, George.
Thank you. And just to answer your question, it was just such a fantastic experience. I was so grateful to be in Brazil. I wish I was there tonight. I'm not going to lie. I wish I wasn't here in London and I was there with you, but this is good enough. This is good enough to see you again. And yeah, thank you for everything that you've done for me while I was there. So yes, I'm gonna talk for about an hour. Maybe I will go for a bit over an hour, basically. And I'm gonna start sharing my screen. One moment. There we go. So today I'm gonna expand on one of the topics that I spoke about in November, back in November. So back in November, when I met some of you, I spoke in general about queering Jungian psychology. And I spoke about this idea that there are some areas in Jungian psychology that are of queer and Jungian interest, or queer Jungian interest, basically. And one of them was this kind of binary of individuation and adaptation. So I'm going to pick up from where I left off in that presentation, or just go into more depth, basically, in one of these areas. Before I start, I want to sort of say that my project is one of trying to see what happens when queer and queer experience meets Jungian psychology and vice versa. And I want to see what happens, because sometimes they don't sit very comfortably together, and sometimes they sit beautifully together, actually. So this is kind of my project, and I suppose I'm going to talk about individuation and adaptation from a queer perspective, and looking at particularly the Red Book and what the Red Book has to offer in relation to these concepts. I'm also going to refer to Jung's collected works, which, particularly what he published after the Red Book. But as you will see, I have a preference for the Red Book. In fact, if you look at this slide of the overview, the second point there is arguing that maybe the Red Book is the queerest of all of Jung's books, is the most queer book of Jung's, basically. Yes, so I'm going to start with, perhaps I'm assuming that some of you are more familiar with Jung, some might be a bit more familiar with queer, and some might be familiar with both, I imagine. But I'm going to try and give just a couple of words, really, in terms of what I'm talking about when I refer to queer, and then why there is a connection with this idea, this Jungian idea of individuation and adaptation, basically. And this will have various kind of facets, basically, this meeting between queer experience and individuation and adaptation. So one of them is around the concept of encountering the other, which is very present in the Red Book, and I'm going to talk about that. Then there is a section titled Wait, and maybe we can wait until we get there to see what I actually mean by that. And then I've titled that following sort of section as individuation, adaptation, and maybe revolution, and see what that brings us. And then also the final point really there is finding your own blue star, which is, you'll hopefully understand what I'm trying to say. It's a reference to Red Book material, really. I should say also that when I talk about queer, I'm also talking about queer theory, but I'm particularly talking about queer experience, queer and trans experience. And you will hear me at times talk about queer or queer and trans, and hopefully it will make a bit of sense why, although I do consider trans to be within the umbrella of queer, I also want to spell out the word trans. I want to put it at the center of what queer means right now, basically. So if I say queer and trans, it doesn't mean that I separate the two. So for those who might not be familiar with what queer means, I thought I'd just give you just a few words and a picture of Marsha P. Johnson in a Pride protest in New York. Marsha P. Johnson was a trans woman of color, a revolutionary, a sex worker. And she's, the quote there is from her. She says, "No pride for some of us without liberation for all of us." The reason I use that is it's right at the center of what I mean by queer. Because queer doesn't mean necessarily a particular sexual orientation or a particular even gender identity. What it does mean is the kinds of ways of being, sexual, gender, relationships, sexual practices that fall outside of what is considered the norm. And of course, that changes over time a lot. And the movement is not linear either. Right now, what we're seeing is a going backwards right now in various countries. I'm not really sure what exactly the situation is in Brazil. I would be very keen to hear from the audience in terms of that. But the situation is essentially in the UK and the US is one where we thought we were going upwards and we thought we were going towards progress, supposedly, but we're not. There are various ways in which governments are trying to take rights back, as well as, particularly in the UK and the US, weaponize transphobia in the quest to for re-election, really, for right-wing parties. And the second quote I'm using there is from Nikki Sullivan, so it is from Queer Theory, and she defined queer theory as the discipline that refuses to be disciplined. I'm not sure whether that makes sense in Portuguese, but it's all about being rebels, really, being protesting and resisting. So if I since I'm defining queer like this, since I'm defining queer as something that is outside the norm rather than a specific sexual orientation, immediately those who understand Jungian terminology would probably see why individuation and adaptation are very relevant. So for those of you who might not be that familiar, individuation for Jung is the development of the psychological individual as a being distinct from the general collective psychology. And I'm underlining this because that's where queer and individuation meet, okay? Because it is about not following the norm, basically, you know. In fact, Jung says that it's always to some extent opposed to collective norms. However, you know, there's a lot of statements that, you know, basically tell us don't get too excited here. You know, this is not a revolutionary kind of concept. It has the potential to be, as I will argue today, but it isn't in the way, it isn't as it is in the way that Jung presents it, at least in some of the ways in which he talks about this. And one of the ways in which he does this is through saying that adaptation has to happen before individuation. It's a little bit confusing. The word adaptation refers to, could be adaptation to the external world, or it could be adaptation to the internal world, which is basically synonymous with individuation. But, you know, it's a bit complex, but usually adaptation is used in relation to the external world. So essentially the narrative is, you have to make it in the world. You have to perhaps have a job, have a family, do the ordinary things, establish yourself before you become a separate psychological individual, before you move out of the norm and look inwards. And of course, that was the narrative, that was the story of Jung's own journey of individuation. I mean, immediately there's a problem with it nowadays, particularly with Jung's idea that adaptation happens in the first half of life, which is up to about 35 apparently, and then individuation is after that age. Well, that's what happened to him. But immediately, if you look at the 21st century today, you know, people of my generation and younger, we know that we're not going to be able to establish ourselves unless we have rich parents, really, because that's where capitalism is today. It's in a place where it's not capable of providing the things that it used to be capable of providing to young people. So, you know, people cannot own property. People don't have permanent jobs. People, you know, people struggle actually to a much larger extent than before. And therefore that leaves us with the question, this narrative of settling down and then having the time and the space to go against the norm is immediately problematic. And there's other conservative, if you like, expressions around this idea. So according to Jung, the individual has to purchase, has to buy her right to individuation, okay? And then he even goes as far as saying, not only has society a right, it has a duty to condemn the individual if she fails to create equivalent values, for she is a deserter. Two things about this. One is that I'm changing the pronouns a lot of Jung. So here I'm saying she, you know, Jung says he. Other times I will say they, and I don't know whether there's an equivalent in Portuguese, but this is part of the queering of Jung, really. So what he's saying now is that if you want to be able to have the space, if you want to look into your soul and individuate, really become yourself, separate, not just a clone, in other words, you know, you have to pay back. You have to offer something to society, and it has to be something of equivalent value. And again, this was Jung's story, as we will see. I think that's the next slide. Yes. Actually, before I get into that, so this was exactly Jung's story in the sense that Jung kind of looked inwards, spent a lot of time, particularly, you know, drawing and writing the Red Book. And then he was able to translate what he discovered in the Red Book in the language of, in the conceptual language of what was then the collected works of Jung. And Sonu Shamdasani, who is the editor of the Red Book, makes this very clear in the extensive introduction to the Red Book, which, you know, for anybody who hasn't read it, I really recommend it. It's so informative. And, you know, he even uses this, and this is an actual photograph of my own copy of the Red Book, and I'm not going to read all of it, but just the last couple of lines. So basically, Jung says that everything after the Red Book basically was merely the outer declassification and the scientific elaboration of what emerged during his confrontation with the unconscious, okay? And I'm just emphasizing, it's the outer classification, it's what he gave the outer world, basically. And it also has perhaps the veneer of scientific language, basically. And the fascinating thing about the Red Book is that, of course, it wasn't published and it wasn't seen, the vast majority of it, for almost 100 years. And I'm making a little joke there by saying that it took almost a century for the Red Book to actually come out of the closet. You know, it was kept, you know, in the vaults or in the closets for all this time. But this is not just a superficial joke, I think. I'm kind of saying it was perhaps too queer to be published widely as it was at the time, or at least that's the decision that Jung made at the time. So yes, too queer in various senses of the word, really. So here's a list of some of the areas that I think the Red Book gives us some input in terms, I mean, there's loads, but these are the ones that I've chosen, and the ones that I think they have something to say to queer people, and queer people have something to say about them. So the first thing to note is that the word individuation doesn't appear in the Red Book, but only once. And that's in the scrutinies in the final section of the Red Book, and it's included in the Latin Principium Individuationis. So it's all the pages are from the Reader's Edition, well, the English Reader's Edition. So I hope you're going to be able to find them in the Portuguese one. So it's interesting also that this is included in the only section of the Red Book that was published before 2009, which is the 7 Sermons to the Dead. And the 7 Sermons to the Dead, that section begins with some explanation about what is individuation, actually, that it is about differentiation, that it is about coming out of the massa confusa and emerging as a distinct individual. That's what individuation is. And then one of the ways in which the idea of individuation is expressed is with the word "the way." So I think it's the first chapter. It's the way of what is to come. And actually, James Hillman and Sonu Shamdasani make this point that actually the word "the way" refers to the process of individuation. So I'm gonna take a look at that briefly. And then another way in which this dilemma is discussed is the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths. So we're gonna look at that as well. And I'm gonna pose some queer questions about that. And then I think it's one of the biggest areas, most interesting areas to me in the Red Book, which I also use a lot in my teaching, is how Jung encounters the other in his active imagination, in his fantasies, how he dreams up the other. And the interesting thing, there's a lot of emphasis on the other in terms of gender, but he also meets the racial other in the Red Book, and he also meets the other in terms of social class. So we're going to look at that and how that relates to queerness, really. And finally, there's the section about waiting, and I'm going to ask you to wait until we get there to see what I mean by that. So I begin with the way, right? And this is from the collected works. Jung begins working with this woman who feels stuck. And he says she didn't want to know how liberation might be possible in a general way, but how and in what way it could come about for her. And about this, I knew as little as she did. So in a way, what's happening here is, I think, is one of the most helpful ways of looking at the process of individuation, which is that actually the analyst and the therapist doesn't have a clue, really, of the particular ways in which the particular patient or the particular person will become themselves, right? There's contradictions because a lot of people have, including Jung, have attempted to come up with quite prescriptive ways in which there are particular stages, and I'm going to look at that and critique that a little bit in a minute. But he also says this, that he doesn't know as much, and he's at his best, I think, Jung is at his best when he acknowledges how little we know as analysts. I prefer this way of expressing it, again from the Red Book. Almost everything, I think there's a kind of a hierarchy in my mind, really, where sometimes developmental psychoanalysis says very similar things to what Jungian analysis says. But my rule of thumb is Jung usually says it in a slightly more poetic way, and that makes a difference, I think. And I think developmental psychoanalysis, in my own experience, often says the same thing in a slightly more pedestrian sort of way. But it's even more poetic in the Red Book. So here he says, you seek the path. So the very beginning of the Red Book, actually. He says, I warn you away from my own path. It can also be the wrong way for you. May each go their own way. And again, I will come back to this expression, may each go their own way, because I think it's so much at the center of what I see as a queer Jungian approach to individuation. So let's look at the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths. Again, for those of you who are not familiar with the Red Book, this is one of the central concepts in it. The first sort of dialogues he has with himself in the Red Book is when sometimes there's the spirit of the times speaking, the spirit of the modern times, and sometimes he feels that he's relating to the spirit of the depths. And what do these represent? Well, the spirit of the times in this case for Jung represents a very scientific kind of knowledge, rationalistic kind of ways of thinking, certainly secular ways of thinking. It's about epistemology, it's about ways of knowing, basically, usually. But it's also about the difference between the inner world and the outer world. This is another thread that will go through my presentation, and I think it's a whole different sort of lecture, really, to think about the inner world and the outer world from various kind of perspectives. But for now, let's just keep that at the back of our minds, that basically the spirit of the times is about, for example, about Jung making it in the outside world, about becoming the president of the International Psychoanalytic Association, about becoming a professor, about having good relations up to a point with Freud. But the spirit of the depths was telling him other things, was inviting him to think about non-rational ways of knowing, was inviting him to think about his intuition and about spirituality, about religion, about the role of all of these things, really. Now, there are some queer questions around this. The first kind of doubts, or the first sort of, not quite objections, but, well, objections actually, from a queer perspective. The first one is, how on earth do we know when we hear an internal voice, whether it comes from the spirit of the times or the spirit of the depths? I think it's a very, very difficult question. And for queer people, for queer and trans people, this is a question that's very, very present. One of the ways in which we can see this is the myth right now, the very widespread myth that gender and sexual variants are new. They are just fashions, they are fads. You know, there is, I mean, I have the information if you want it, but there is all this kind of discourse right now, this discredited pseudo-diagnosis of rapid onset gender dysphoria, which implies that trans people are trans because they're just copying their friends, because it's become something fashionable, rather than actually, so in other words, that transness belongs to the spirit of the times, whereas actually there is a very credible, very convincing argument to be made, particularly about transness and of course about sexual diversity, that it's always been around. And there's various examples from all over the world. In fact, perhaps it's much more accurate to say that the gender binary, limiting people into two sort of categories, is something that is very much connected to Western, Northern Hemisphere, colonialism, really, and introduced the gender binary in various parts of the world where colonized, and the white colonists were often horrified to see gender variance, particularly, in the racial other, really. I mean, queer people are familiar with these kinds of myths. We were all told at some point that we're just going through a phase, that we don't know what we think, that rather than our queerness coming from the depths, rather than our queerness having almost divine importance, spiritual importance, we've always been told, particularly in modernity and postmodernity, that we're just being superficial. We don't really know what we're talking about. This is not our truth. Our truth coming from the spirit of the depths, in other words, has been sort of questioned. But the other queer sort of questioning is this questioning of the valorization of the depths versus the times. That actually we know that there have been times where what is associated with the depths, which unfortunately with Jung sometimes is just what is traditional, is considered to be often, in a slightly unthinking way, I think, considered to belong to the spirit of the depths. Rather, and that sometimes that has been oppressive, actually, for queer people. And I know that in myself, when I heard first time this distinction, that was my knee-jerk reaction. And I think for a lot of queer people, there is also this fantasy of going forwards, progress, that the past is bad, and which is not as straightforward as I said. Okay, I'm going to try and summarize one of the most complex papers in a few sentences. So we're moving to the next area, which is about the encountering the other. And I wanted to start with Judith Butler, because their paper, Melancholy Gender, is a really good example of what queer says about otherness. So in very simple terms, which probably I'm not going to do justice to Butler's paper, gender and sexual identities, according to Butler, are basically founded upon unacknowledged grief. Basically, essentially, a simple way of saying this is that, and Butler really uses the idea of the Oedipus complex to explain all of this, and the whole idea of mourning and melancholia. But essentially what Butler says is that for me to say I am a man, this is usually, they say, based on pretending that I'm not a woman, that I'm only a man, pretending that if I imagine me as a heterosexual, that I've never, wanted the same-sex parent. So in other words, Butler says that in order for me to establish a male heterosexual identity, what I need to do is pretend that I've never had an identification with the opposite sex, in inverted commas, parent, and I've never had desire towards the same sex parent, basically. And Butler says this is problematic, obviously, right? And this is why, it explains a lot of homophobia, because it gets you in touch with a kind of grief that you haven't quite allowed yourself to experience. But here's the thing: I think Butler focuses it very much on the ideas of the Oedipus complex. I think Jungian ideas almost give it a bit more air, this idea, I think, because according to Jung's idea of the self with a capital S, well, that self with a capital S contains everything, is vast, really. Nothing is outside the self of that self, really. So in other words, according to Jungian ideas, it doesn't have to necessarily do with parental desire and identification. Actually, the unconscious, the vast self with a capital S contains everything, to the extent that it's meaningless for me to say I am not a woman. It's meaningless for me to say I am not trans. It's meaningless for me to say I am not heterosexual. I mean, this is within reason, okay? This is because this can also be used to flatten any real differences and any real oppressions. Obviously, from a societal point of view, I am clearly not a woman in the sense that I am read in the street as a man. I am not a black person from the sociological point of view. The police never harasses me in the streets of London. If I was a black man, that would be the case. However, on a deeper unconscious level, the Jungian self contains everything. And therefore, the encounter with the other becomes a very interesting thing. It becomes an encounter with a part of the self. And one of the most beautiful, I think, ways in which Jung expresses this, which is very challenging, is that he quotes the Roman playwright and former slave, Terence, who said, "Nothing human is alien to me." It's such a challenging invitation for us all to say that nothing human is alien. If a human does it, it's not alien. If a human is something, then it's not alien to me. It's not easy to, I'm not suggesting that it's easy to achieve. In fact, it's very, very difficult to achieve. But this is part of what individuation also means. So here's a slightly different take from the collected works, which I will slightly critique. So he says, those on the path of individuation will infallibly run into things that will thwart and cross them. I think he does a nice play with words there, with cross and crucifixion. I'm not going to go into it right now, but cross has this double meaning. So cross in English also means irritate somebody, you know, but also put on the cross, crucify, basically. So here's how Jung does this kind of sequence. He says, the first thing they come across is the thing they have no wish to be, and that's the fantastic simple definition of the shadow. The second thing is the thing they are not. It's the other, the individual reality of the you. And the third is their psychic non-ego, which is the collective unconscious. And that's from Psychology of the Transference, Collected Work 16. Now, there are some queer and trans questions there, or concerns. The first one, I think, is this distinction, which I really kind of was thinking about the last couple of weeks, particularly. This distinction between the shadow and the anima, because I think what he means with the second one is the anima, the thing that you are not. And what is this distinction, basically? You know, so if I encounter an other who is evil in my dreams, that is my shadow. But if I encounter another who is the gendered other, it's something completely different, according to Jung. And I am wondering about the usefulness of this. And I do think that it's to do with the fact that the thing that was very numinous, that was very powerful for Jung, was young women. That's why he encountered young women in his unconscious, and they troubled him. They troubled him in the external world, and they troubled him in his internal world. And therefore, the distinction is important to him. But I don't think we need it nowadays. I do think that it betrays this obsession with the gender binary, really, that elevates gender as the most important distinction in the universe, the most important opposition. And I don't think that we need that in the 21st century. And the second objection is this sequence, that it first has to be the thing that, the shadow, then it has to be anima, and then it has to be. And actually, I think that the reality is that these things, apart from them not being so clearly distinguished in my mind, they also appear in various ways. Even the way in which Jung means them, I think they also appear in various different times. And I also think that there's something about the whole idea of individuation being a process that can be described in particular phases. I think is problematic, and queers take issue with them, really. But let's go back to the Red Book for a little bit, just to remind you all the ways in which Jung encounters the other in the Red Book, in his fantasies, in his active imaginations. So, and these are fascinating. If I think, well, I mean, I do this whole thing with undergraduate students where we read particularly these sections that are about difference, and it's a lot of fun to read it with other people, and I recommend it. So, of course, he meets Salome and he's horrified. What is Salome doing here? Why is Salome, this evil person, appears in my fantasies and therefore pretends that she is important in my path to individuation? And Salome and Elijah tell him, actually, we are very much part of this journey, Then there is also the maiden in the castle in the forest, this young woman. And again, Jung is horrified. What is this? What is this young woman? This sounds like a romantic novel, he says, he can't quite, because he associates, and he's, in a way, he's quite transparent, that he associates femininity with all of these awful things in a misogynistic kind of way, with superficiality, with blindness, with feeling rather than thinking, like all of this stuff. But these women tell him, sorry, Carl, but we are important, actually, and we are important in your journey to become yourself, not just important in general. He also meets the racial other. I'm just going to skip to the next slide to show you the racial other in Izdubar. I mean, the fascinating thing about Izdubar is that, he's the racial other, and the name that Jung chose is the wrong name, and he knew that. So this is the name that Westerners thought that Gilgamesh, that's how they thought it was pronounced. And Jung, if you read the very helpful footnotes in that sort of section, Jung explains that, Sonu Shamdasani, explains that Izdubar was what Westerners thought Gilgamesh was called. And Jung knew that. Why did he? Because I think he has this hidden message there that this is about my projections, Jung is saying. And I think that's really helpful. And then he also comes across the other in terms of social class in the chapter 1 of The Lowly, which is also a very moving chapter, actually. So all of these are really important aspects of individuation for Jung, important sort of moments, if you like, in terms of individuation. But they are placed, as I said, in an order, and queerness has this objection about time, and there is this idea of queer time. There are some quotes there, I'm kind of aware of the time, and I don't want to go into them too much. I want to just focus on maybe the second one, which kind of encapsulates more or less what I want to say here, which is, and it's from Raoul Rao and this book, Out of Time, The Queer Politics of Postcoloniality, that I really recommend. And Rao says, the queer person has been constructed as a temporally primitive, in inverted commas, figure. And there is this intersection of race and queerness that basically both of them, both race and queer, both brown people, if you like, and queer people have been seen as belonging to an earlier time. If you look at Marie-Louise von Franz's book on the puer, which is the kind of the Peter Pan sort of syndrome, she talks about the illness of homosexuality and relates it to arrested development, basically. A bit like developmental psychoanalysts were, very good at coming up with theories like that, but obviously that's also present in Jung and Jungian thinking, both in terms of homosexuality at times, and in terms of the racial other, again, at times, but I think it's important to sort of acknowledge that. Okay, the waiting has ended, and I'm gonna tell you what this is about, the wait. So this is an interesting section for me because I am geographically, as you know, I'm based in London. Jungians in London are very influenced by the object relations school. And within the object relations school, one of the really central sort of tenets of the object relations school, really, which is it's not as explicit, actually, it's a bit sort of an undercurrent, if you like, is that essentially maturity, therefore individuation in some way, involves not evading frustration, tolerating frustration. And the equivalent of that is where the wait sort of thing comes from. And this is very present in psychoanalytic literature. It's also very influential within some London and UK Jungians, not all. And there is an equivalent of it in Jungian psychology, I think. It's expressed in again, I think in much more beautiful ways, but nevertheless, they are important, and queer has something to say about them. So, for example, when Jung finds himself in a desert, he desperately asks his soul what to do in the way that any of us who might be in any kind of crisis might speak to an analyst or a therapist or a friend, and we really just want to know what the hell to do, what's happening, why, you know, when am I going to get out of this pain, you know? And the soul initially stays silent, lets him ask all the anxious questions, and then simply says one word: wait. And Jung responds by saying, I heard the cruel word, torment belongs to the deserts. So in a way, what to do, the answer to what to do is wait. The answer to what to do is basically you need to engage with the opposites in classical Jungian thinking. You need to grapple with your dilemma, and you need to have some faith that something useful will emerge. I mean, I'm saying this in a lot more words. I think it's much more poignant to hear the word wait and Jung saying, I heard the cruel word. But there is also a parallel in alchemy and in the narrative of alchemy. I wish we had time to look at all of it because it's a fascinating narrative in my view. But kind of at the middle, the two images come from roughly the middle of the narrative, and there are two stages. You know, for those of you who are not familiar, actually, what Jung discovered in the Red Book, he then found it more or less confirmed in various other stories of what individuation really and development means, right? And the psychology of the transference really describes these images, the alchemical woodcuts, and it's basically a parallel to what he discovered in the Red Book. So the middle phase is death and the ascent of the soul. It's a hopeless place. It's a dark place. It's the place where, you know, you feel that maybe there's no hope, that maybe you should leave your partner, or maybe you should leave, if you're training as an analyst, you might be tempted to leave your training as an analyst. I can assure you that does happen to a lot of people, or any kind of therapist. Or it might be that you want to leave your analysis, or whatever it might be. And this kind of discourse of tolerating frustration, and also the wait sort of discourse that I'm talking about here, it says that basically it's probably best to wait again, right? So it says this phase, Jung says, is demanding the greatest patience, the greatest courage, and the greatest faith on the part of both the doctor and the patient. So this is offered as one of the stages of development, really, and individuation. And again, Queer has a lot of objections about this idea of waiting. And I'm using this screenshot from the website of the Gender Identity Clinic in London, from NHS, from the National Health Service in England. And it has the waiting list figures. Okay, this is so somebody who is referred for gender affirming care, to either receive hormones or to receive some help in, you know, deciding, or to, you know, be referred for an operation or anything like that. Somebody who was first referred in July 2018 will have their first appointment in February. These figures are from February 2023. Almost 5 years of waiting, actually. And during this time, you know, I mean, the people who we're talking about now, they've been through the pandemic, and, you know, they've been through all of this, and now, you know, they're going to have finally their first appointment. It's, you know, there is a myth that trans children and trans adults are just, you know, almost like walking into a pharmacy. That's the fantasy, and that's the myth. They walk into a pharmacy and they you know, or they walk into a hospital and they get an operation or whatever it is. It's really, really far from the truth. But the whole idea of waiting is also highly political. I'm not saying, by the way, it's a really helpful idea, this idea of waiting. And so in so many ways, for so many of my patients, and for so many times in my own development, waiting was the best thing to do, and tolerating the pain of waiting was the best thing to do. But it also has a political connotations, actually. Who has the privilege to wait in some ways? in some areas in particular. So I'm quoting here James Baldwin, who says, I was born here in the US almost 60 years ago. I am not going to live another 60 years. You always told me it takes time. It's taken my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brother's time, my sister's time. How much time do you want for your progress? It's a very powerful sort of argument, yes. It's, you know, okay, I'm kind of changing to a slightly different sort of area. This is Paul Preciado, a trans philosopher, Spanish, active in France. And this is from his book, which was originally a speech, Can the Monster Speak? And he says, the success or failure of my analytic sessions largely depended not on the fidelity of the analysts to Freud, Klein, or Lacan, but on the contrary, on the infidelity. Or to put it another way, on the creativity, their ability to step outside of the cage. The reason why I'm including this is that actually I think that patients sometimes are very perceptive, understand a lot about where the therapist sits in terms of this dilemma of individuation versus adaptation. I think they can sometimes with great accuracy, I think, detect how much the therapist has gone into a conformist mode versus when the therapist is allowing herself to step outside of the box and step outside of what is considered to be the received wisdom. And to be an analyst, you know, at the moment, especially in the UK, you have to step outside of the norm to treat trans people with respect, really, because the norm is not respectful, actually. On average, I would say it's not respectful. And the other thing he says, which I find interesting, is that he also speaks of psychoanalysts who he would describe as dissident in practice, but silent and discreet in theory. So, and this made me think, so in other words, he knows of analysts who were very different with him as a trans individual versus what they would say publicly. They would keep quiet sort of publicly. And this reminded me of Jung, actually. Because my great colleague, Nick Litersky, a non-binary Jungian academic who wrote the fantastic paper, Defacing Dionysus. Well, Nick unearthed, I didn't know this existed, the only paper that Jung wrote on gender-affirming surgery in Collected Works 18. I think it's called On the Question of Medical Intervention or something like that. And look, Jung, to his credit, he more or less says it's a matter between the doctor and the patient. This was one of the first gender reassignment surgeries. You know, there was a bit of an uproar, a bit of a scandal, and that's what Jung said. But he also said the following couple of things. He says, if Dr. Boss gave her, even though Jung says him, misgenders the trans patient, but, you know, man of his time, etc. So if Dr. Boss gave her this advice, that that is his own private affair, and something that one does not make a song and dance about it in public. In other words, maybe the doctor and patient come to an agreement for this gender reassignment surgery, but these should be kept quiet. And then he also says, I can't see some of this anyway, that the doctors shouldn't be surprised if there is a collective reaction against it, basically. You know, and there is this discourse, and he explains this by saying there is this numinosity with which the penis is treated, and he's got a point, but he doesn't mention, and I imagine he was aware of, the numinosity of castration itself, that actually castration or mutilating the genitals, you know, was also had a numinous sort of power, and people do it in spiritual, within the context of their spirituality often. But the main reason I'm talking about this is because there is this discourse about knowing what the social norm is. This is why I've underlined that the doctor should not be surprised. So there's this discourse about knowing the norms, and that this is an important first step in being a decent human being, almost, you know. And I'm going to warn you that the next couple of slides, there is a trigger warning at the top because they refer to homophobic and gender-based violence. I want to say a couple of things before I go to the next slides. First of all, that there is description, not a graphic description of violence, but there is quite a lot of homophobia and transphobia, I would say, in the next couple of slides. So I want to warn you. But I also want to say that this is in an otherwise not bad text. It's a text that has a lot of useful stuff in it, I would say. But it contains this case study, which I think is so telling of the kinds of criticism I would make towards some depth psychology, i.e. psychoanalysis and Jungian psychology, response to trans, and also not just to trans, but also generally to this idea of adaptation and adapting to societal reality, really. So, this is by two Ulanovs. They're a couple, the two authors, Anne and Barry, I believe. And I really want to emphasize this is otherwise a good text, but this is pretty disappointing. So this is a case. A gay man fell into active identification with his anima, the authors say. He lived collectively rather than as a person, as a caricature of the opposite sex, never integrating the contrasexual into his own personal identity as a gay man. So before I move on, there's more to it. There's quite a bit more to it. Before I move on, I want to identify a couple of things. First of all, why is it that it's a caricature? Why is it, there's something, I was talking to some colleagues yesterday about this, and there were, really a colleague I really sort of admire and appreciate. Her name is Sarah Sage from the Queer Jungian Initiative. She pointed out, she reminded me, I suppose, how misogyny doesn't have to be related to people who are assigned female at birth. There can be a man who attracts misogyny, and this is, this idea that femininity is theatrical is a misogynistic idea, whether it refers to a person assigned male at birth or a person assigned female at birth. It's a misogynistic idea, really. But also there's this kind of defensive, they're trying to sort of convey to us that they don't mind him being gay. But what they do think is that his gender expression, they clearly find pathological, and wrong, really. So that's the beginning of the case study. Then one evening, this man is attacked and is almost killed. And the next slide contains the response of the authors, which I find really disturbing. So the authors say, as a result of this terrifying incident, the man integrated his feminine components more securely into his own male identity, because really he is a man. That's the thing that they want to really establish, basically, right? So the femininity has to be integrated in some way, not too loud, effectively, right? He took on some weight. For some reason, taking up weight is a mark of masculinity. Stood up more solidly and carried his gay manhood from the inside as something substantial in his identity, not a theatrical facade. Again, this idea of theatrical. And then he looked now like a person who could not be knocked over. And the shocking thing about this is that the authors really sound like they're blaming him for the attack. He was standing in a way that could be knocked over. And I think that's really, really problematic. And it gets even worse, I think, where the authors say he had learned a terrible lesson, that savage reaction to unintegrated feminine elements in him nearly cost him his life. So okay, they are saying that it's the savage reaction, but it's a reaction to the unintegrated, to something pathological, right? They're seeing it as pathological or unintegrated, right? So it nearly cost him his life, but ultimately had saved it by what it taught him. So it's an attack that taught him a lesson. I hope you're as horrified as I am, because I think this is an example of taking societal norms and elevating them to something that is always right, actually. So what about, so this is a you know, obviously these things happen all the time in our practices if you're working as therapists. So, you know, somebody begins to, you know, want to express themselves in a gender that's not assigned, the one assigned at birth. What do we say? According to this model, we should say to them, well, you need to understand that this triggers a lot of reaction. So you have to be, but I mean, you know, who are we to decide that for somebody, right? And I'm not saying that, of course, that needs to be thought about, but it seems here that the decision is made that the solution to that is one. The solution is to not express oneself in that way. And actually, there are many solutions. It could be that, you know, within the bounds of, you know, how to keep safe, you find other ways to express yourself. It could be that you don't walk home alone. It could be all sorts of things. It could be that you move to a different neighborhood. It could be all sorts of different solutions. And it could, of course, be, and this is the next area that I'm going to go into in terms of this individuation versus adaptation sort of idea. It could be that you rebel against these norms, that you kick up a fuss, that you find others and you organize and you try to fight these norms, not necessarily on your own. But this whole kind of dilemma, these kinds of dilemmas, really, I had some others, but I know that the time is you know, it would have taken a lot longer to finish the presentation. So, but you know, one of the things that they remind me of is the Serenity Prayer from Alcoholics Anonymous. People might have heard of it. It's basically, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference between the two. Okay, which is again a very helpful prayer, really, and it's. You know, it's appealing to God in the sense that actually this is something that, you know, we are often very, you know, how do we make decisions like this? How do we make a decision? When is it that we stand up and we say, no, this is not right, versus adapt to what is offered us, you know, versus just the calmness, the kind of serenity that's required to compromise. Compromise is important. I'm not saying it isn't. But how can we tell the difference? And the fact that this is a prayer, I think, conveys the fact that there aren't rational ways to decide that, I don't think. Or at least very often, this kind of decision is not based on logic, but it's based on what we feel inside, actually, whether we're up for the fight or not. And this is where I think my background in kind of political activism and analytical psychology often don't sit very well comfortably with each other. So, you know, the version by Angela Davis is, I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept. And of course, the way to do it, and I'm not saying, you know, we should never accept the things we cannot change. Of course, there is a place for accepting the things we can't change. This happens so often in somebody's development, but actually there are times to not accept, to try to change things that are unacceptable. And in my experience, at least, the way to do that is with other people. And unfortunately, analytical psychology, well, classical analytical psychology, because subsequent analytical psychology does allow for this, but classical Jungian psychology doesn't quite allow for this, because Jung had quite a bit of contempt towards the masses, basically. This picture is from when the Chilean left-wing president got elected. So, and I've got a couple of quotes. You know, I think, you know, he had contempt towards groups of people. He always saw them as oppressive and as pushing us towards becoming clones. Really, that was his thinking about groups and about protest and about all of these things. And it's a shame because of course groups have that potential. Even queer communities have the potential to be oppressive, have the potential to be racist often when they're dominated by white people, have the potential to create their own norms that can be also oppressive, etc., etc. You know, it's not, I'm not denying that, you know, but actually for queer people, very often, a very important step in individuation is becoming oneself through being part of a community. And in Jungian psychology, at least that Jungian psychology, that early Jungian psychology doesn't allow for that. And I'm perfectly happy. I'm not holding this against Jung. I can forgive Jung about this very easily because he also tells me that I can make up my own mind about these things, really. You know, he does say what he says, and I have the right to sort of say, well, he was, you know, he married a really rich woman, you know, collective action didn't appeal to him. He just saw it as potential for oppression, really. Okay, I'm aware of the time. I'm going to try and finish soon. And just the first quote of these two is just to point out that he specifically spoke about protest as being the opposite of adaptation. And he, in some ways, he's right, although you can also see adaptation as adapting to the fact that you need other people in order to challenge awful things. I mean, I was kind of toying with whether to share a story with you of one of the most stupid things I've ever done as an activist. So one of the most stupid things I've ever done was that when I was about 23, I walked past a stall with neo-Nazis handing out leaflets. And when I say neo-Nazis, I mean proper neo-Nazis, you know, people who thought that Hitler was amazing, basically. And I was on my own, and I took one of the leaflets and I tore it in front of them. And of course, that was one of the most stupid things I've ever done in my life. And thankfully, I was 23 and not 44, so I could run. Because, you know, you can't change the world alone like this. You can't sort of try and fight these things on your own. So adapting to reality to some extent means don't do that. You know, you're in danger. They chased me, and you know, I don't think I've ever run faster than that afternoon in Athens in the early 2000s, basically. But we should also say he has this contempt, Jung has this contempt towards the masses, but he also says absence of community is suffering and sickness. Community in everything is dismemberment and dissolution. So he says being without community is bad, it's not helpful, but if everything is about community, that's also unhelpful. And that's from the Red Book as well. I mean, Andrew Samuels is one of the best people to read in relation to this, and he talks about the spiritual aspect of protest and collective action. I really recommend his work on all of this. Okay, we're almost done. So the final bit I want to talk about in relation to individuation is you know, this painting doesn't appear in the Red Book itself. It's contained in another book called The Art of C.G. Jung, and it's called Systema Mundi Totius, and it's basically the kind of the way he saw the self and the universe as a result of the 7 sermons to the dead. And there are various different aspects there, and they're all very meaningful. And you know, I would recommend the book, The Art of C.G. Jung, because there's some good sort of material in there. Pardon me. But the reason I've included this mainly is that it includes right in the middle the blue star. And the blue star emerges as a motif in some of the paintings of the Red Book. And it's only mentioned a couple of times, I believe, explicitly. But basically, the blue star is one of the ways in which individuation is expressed in the Red Book. Okay, so essentially, that's what it stands for is the divine nature in human beings. Basically, if I remember right, that's kind of what it. And basically, a more pedestrian way of saying it is what are you about? You know, what is it that, you know, that is your purpose, really, which is synonymous with individuation, really. And identifying that for each person and how difficult it can be. But there's something about this kind of blue star that sort of conveys this idea. As I said, the whole idea of inner world and outer world is basically a thread at the background of everything that I've said today. And it could be a separate sort of lecture, as I said. There's so much around it. And I'm including it with this painting because I think there's something about this, that is it the solar, is it like a solar system? Is it like a, is it a system of planets? Is it, in other words, a very external kind of thing? Or is it an internal thing? And, because it does look like planets, doesn't it? But it's both, actually, in a way. And I really also recommend Saban's, Saban, which is called Two Souls Alas in 2019. And the whole book is about the inner and outer world and the spirit of the times and the depths and personality number 1 and number 2. Very, very helpful analysis of Jung's ideas in this. But he quotes at some point, he quotes Jung's From Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which is, towards the end of his life, basically. And Jung then says in, I can't remember when it is, mid-1900s, where he says that at the time that he wrote the Red Book, he saw a contradiction between inner and outer world that was irreconcilable at the time, and that he could not see the interaction of both worlds, which I now understand. Why I'm including this? Because in a way, this distinction of adapting to the external world, you do that first, then you adapt to the internal world. Well, actually, and also how this is done, and the prescriptive ways sometimes that some Jungians at least have expressed this, that, basically you become a hermit in order to engage with your kind of process of individuation. You have to become a hermit and look at your inner world. Well, actually, my experience has been very different to this. And, as I said also in the conference back in November, the way in which I found spirituality was through protest and through sex. And I think Jung allows sexuality for sure. He says that sexuality is, it's an expression of the divine nature. And subsequent Jungians have spoken about how politics as well could also be the process of soul making and the process of individuation as well. So what I'm trying to say, I suppose, is that actually we don't need this distinction necessarily as clear cut, as in such a kind of rigid way, basically. Okay, and this is my final slide, which I can't see, unfortunately. I'm going to have to do this. So this is Alok Vade Menon. I recommend you follow them on social media as they're a non-binary activist and author and, icon, really. And I'm using their image, their gender non-conforming, in such a beautiful way, I would say, with some words from the Red Book, where Jung also conveys something of what I've been trying to say about the inner world and the outer world, and how, there shouldn't be such a great distinction between the two. So, and it's interesting because I was looking for this quote, I remembered it, and I thought it was at the end of the Red Book. It isn't actually, it's at the very beginning. It's where he talks about the way, and he says, again, may each one seek their own way. The way, your way, leads to mutual love in community. Humans will come to see and feel the similarity and communality of their ways. What he's saying here is, we don't need to be prescriptive about each other's individuation journeys. We don't. Each one of us has to discover their own blue star. Well, in my case, it will be a red star because I'm a socialist, but Jung's star was blue, and the equivalent, really. So you finding your own blue star or red star or whatever it is will eventually lead to us, loving each other in community, to us coming in community and discovering how similar we actually are. And I think this is why is it that we get anything out of thinking about other people's individuation journeys. I'm just going to stop sharing now and hopefully see human beings. There we go. Why is it, I'm going to finish with this, why is it that we might take an interest in another person's individuation journey, if not that actually it can be inspiring? So we read Jung's individuation, we read about Jung's individuation, and it can be inspiring as long as we don't copy, as long as we don't become a clone of Jung. And the same with queer. Queer and trans is inspiring, not because you all have to be queer and trans. I mean, if maybe you want, I think, you know, go ahead and be queer and trans, but it's not necessarily about becoming queer and trans. It's about, you know, what Alok says is that they teach not about transness necessarily, they teach about freedom. So it's about them finding their own blue star, you know, whatever you want to call it. Well, that's me. Thank you.
Obrigado, Jorge. Excelente apresentação. Muito rica, vasta. Bom ter você conosco aqui. Bom, gente, vamos lá. Quem desejar fazer perguntas, por favor, coloque o nome no chat. Eu chamo a pessoa e a pessoa faz a pergunta direta para o Jorge, tá? Jorge, vou começar. Vou abrir aqui os trabalhos, trazendo uma questão. Em determinados ambientes junguianos tradicionais, sempre que há um movimento de tentar pensar Jung, o pensamento junguiano, junto com um pensador contemporâneo, Jung com Deleuze, Jung com Simondon, como Mark Saban, que está no Brasil hoje, está pensando na individuação em Simondon e Jung. Jung como Lacan, como Susan Rowland faz, Jung com o movimento queer, Butler e Preciado, rapidamente aparecem duas conclusões rápidas. A primeira, a mais óbvia, isso não é Jung. Isso não é Jung. A segunda não há por que há essa necessidade de se buscar pensadores, filosofias contemporâneas para buscar uma espécie de legitimidade do pensamento junguiano nos dias atuais. Eu te perguntaria, como responder a essa reação tão conservadora e, ao mesmo tempo, se nós não fizermos essas parcerias, essas interlocuções, como a psicologia junguiana irá sobreviver? Queria te ouvir um pouco sobre isso.
Because I have been speaking for just over an hour, can I take a couple of questions and then respond? Because this is a beautiful question, but yeah, I would like to take another question, you know, if that's okay, before I respond.
Evidente, sem problema algum. Vamos lá, gente. Perguntas?
Vou fazer uma, então.
Então, Lu, vamos lá.
Jorge, amei a sua palestra, sensacional, apesar de você não ter falado 3 tigres tristes dessa vez na nossa palestra, que lá no Freedom você falou e foi aplaudido em pé, né, em português. A palestra estava excelente. Eu fiquei com uma questão que eu já venho tendo essa questão com os atendimentos de pessoas não binárias e trans, né, que aparecem no meu consultório. Existe eu acho que a gente pode dizer um preconceito mesmo de pessoas, de feministas radicais, né, com pessoas trans e não binárias, elas, né, feministas com transfobias. E para mim é muito difícil de entender como é que essas pessoas não conseguem se unir nessa rede tão importante que você que você diz que precisa ter nesse mundo queer, né? Então, assim, me explica um pouco, assim, como é que isso acontece? São pessoas que não estão dentro do movimento, são pessoas que estão ainda nessa dominância patriarcal, né? Como é que a gente pode ajudar essas pessoas, inclusive, quando chegam no nosso consultório do outro lado, né? Não os trans, mas as feministas radicais também. Queria te ouvir um pouquinho disso.
Jorge, tem mais uma pergunta, pode ser? Tá. Só antes de chamar o Haroldo, os convidados que o Jorge trouxe para cá, por favor, fiquem à vontade também, caso queiram fazer perguntas, tá bom? Haroldo, por favor.
Consegue me ouvir?
Sim, sim, sim. Tudo bem?
Tudo bem. Eu queria fazer uma pergunta, não sei se eu faço em inglês ou em português.
Faz em português, Haroldo, por favor. Pode ser?
Melhor, né? Tá bom. Bom, eu escrevi até aqui a pergunta, né? Quando a gente fala sobre teoria queer, né? Parece que a gente está falando sobre terapia LGBTQ+. Mas, na verdade, é o caso que essa teoria fala de todas as experiências, né? O que ela faz é repensar elas à luz da hegemonia e da não hegemonia. Então, reconhecendo que tem assim um esforço, o Jorge citou o Preciado, né, que faz isso na psicanálise, mas que tem um esforço de repensar a psicologia à luz dessa hegemonia, né, que é em torno da teoria queer, né, e que, ao meu entender, questionar não a teoria básica exatamente, né, ou desfazer os conceitos, mas desconstruir uma compreensão em torno dos conceitos, que também é cultural, né? A minha pergunta para o Jorge como que a gente pode aprofundar ainda mais essa crítica dentro da psicologia analítica, dentro de Jung? Desculpa todo o contexto, mas achei que era importante.
Tem mais uma pergunta aqui que eu recebi no direct do André. Eu não sei se o André quer fazer a pergunta ou se ele quer que eu leia. André? Vou ler. Ele me pediu para ler. Eu gostaria de perguntar sobre como a sociedade contemporânea pode se posicionar em relação à individuação, entendendo a psicologia junguiana como propulsora do pensamento ideológico de aceitação do outro.
Yes, I mean, it looks like I might have to speak for another hour, but I'm going to try not to. These are really important questions. I mean, I am not 100% sure that I understood the last couple of questions, but I'm going to try and respond and see. First of all, Luciana, I wanted to say that when I first met a lot of you, for those of you who weren't in Sao Paulo in November, at the Freedom Day conference, I found a shortcut to get the Brazilians to like me, which is that I spoke with the Brazilian Portuguese accent, and the title of the film, and that was my way to charm the Brazilians, really. So I'm sorry I didn't do it today. Maybe I took you for granted. But yeah, thank you for these questions. They're so important, such important questions. I want to start with Marcus. So the question of this is not Jung, I would say yes and no at the same time. And what is the problem? I mean, I'll tell you what I'm reminded of. I think I read this in the book by Sonu Shamdasani and James Hillman, The Lament of the Dead. I think it's in there, but if you want, I can try and find it another point, where apparently there is this story where somebody goes to see Jung privately and tells Jung, Dr. Jung, I'm really sorry, but I think that I don't agree with your idea of the archetypes. And apparently Jung looked at him in a conspiratorial kind of way and went, shh, almost like, who cares? Who cares that you might not agree with me on one particular sort of concept, really, you know? I mean, this is what I would say to those, and I don't know how Jungian that is to sort of, you know, I mean, he's very explicit in the Red Book. Get off my path, he says. It's my path, it's not your path. Of course, he contradicts himself other times, and he is very prescriptive sometimes, etc. But, you know, I think in a way, we're either imprisoned by a thinker or we are liberated by a thinker. And I think we can use Jung in either a really oppressive way and become his clones, or, you know, we can be liberated by his ideas and develop his ideas and be more creative. So, I mean, I think we are of the same opinion on this. So you know, and then this other question of why do we need to look at others? I think you also answered that question yourself, right? In a way, how does, and I don't know what the situation is in Brazil again, because I get a sense that there's so many, you know, Brazilian Jungians, but of course it's a huge country. So, you know, I'm not sure what to make of this, but I know that in the UK, all the analytic trainings, you know, the Jungian analytic trainings, the psychoanalytic trainings, they're shrinking, they are trying to find ways to survive, actually. And I don't think it's far-fetched to say that one of the reasons that, you know, they're struggling to survive is this resistance to other kinds of thinking. You know, a young person nowadays, you know, you wouldn't want to join a cult. You would want to join an open thinking space. I think there's something also very interesting about my experience of, you know, teaching Jungian psychology at a university versus the experience in Jungian organizations. And I think it's day and night. The difference is massive, because universities, by definition, are inviting you to constantly develop your ideas and to not be a cult, actually, you know. But of course, you know, you have, as you probably know already, 100% of my solidarity in these kinds of conversations of renewing Jungian thinking. The question from Luciana is also, I mean, incredibly difficult and important as well, which is that, you know, unfortunately, it's a very widespread phenomenon. Well, I think the widespread phenomenon is this, that at the moment, it's much broader than just the trans issue. It's that I think, you know, in the UK, we have a government that is full of people of color, brown people. We have a brown person who is a prime minister, a brown person who is the home secretary, who enforces the most racist policies, actually. So there's some, and then there is the utilization of supposedly women's rights to attack trans people. You know, there's all sorts of different, and it can be a very confusing environment. And, you know, I'm obviously, you know, there's something sensitive about me being a man and having an opinion on feminism. But the feminism that I subscribe to is intersectional feminism. And non-intersectional feminism has always been of one type of woman only. It has only been the rich, the white, you know, who wanted, you know, more rights, who wanted to get more representation in film, more representation in government. And so what for working class women, for Black women, for trans women, for sex workers, for all of these women, really. So, you know, a feminism that isn't intersectional and that kind of immediately sort of tries to kind of have this rigid approach towards trans people is not, you know, and actually the interesting thing is statistics. I don't have the statistics right now with me, but I have seen statistics that show that even though supposedly it's a feminist critique towards trans people, actually the statistics are very clear that transphobia is much more prevalent among men than it is among women. Right, despite the narrative that says that trans women in particular are a threat to women. Not to mention, of course, the really clear-cut sort of, again, facts, statistics that say wherever, there's more rights for trans people, it hasn't led to people being assaulted and all these kind of things, really. There was one case of a rapist here in the UK who was a trans woman, and it was first news because the media here is absolutely, and it's the only case I have heard all of this time. And Ireland, for example, a country right next door to us, they have much more trans favorable kind of laws. People like access toilets, access sort of, women's refugees. It's very interesting, the whole idea of women's refugees, because in a way, and I think I know one of my colleagues here who has experience of kind of in these spaces, but the argument is that, of course, there are sometimes some women who may feel uncomfortable, but the reality is trans women have been accessing women's refuges for years with zero problems, as far as I understand. And also that trans women are so often victims of domestic abuse. So they need refugees, domestic violence refugees, disproportionately, actually, precisely because often transphobia means, that sometimes a trans woman is in a relationship with a cisgender man, and because of all sorts of reasons and shame and transphobia, etc., they're often attacked in their relationships, really. So they are in much more need of these refugees. So I mean, as you can see, I can talk about this for a long time. But yeah, thank you for this question. And of course, it's difficult. It's not easy. But I do think that there is a coalition. In the UK, it's very clear to me. There is a very clear coalition between the ultra right, basically the right and transphobic sort of elements that supposedly are feminist, but really aren't, in my view. I'm not sure I understood the question by Aroldo. Something about queer therapy, LGBT therapy. How can we deepen? I didn't quite understand what is it that was the question about deepening. So if that person is able to clarify, that would be great. And then there was also something about contemporary individuation and accepting the other. So again, I'm not sure I understood what the question was there from the translation, but I do think...
Jorge.
Yes.
Quer que o Haroldo faça a pergunta em inglês direto? Talvez possa ser interessante, né?
That would be fantastic.
Haroldo, tá aí?
Claro, estou aqui, Marcos. Posso fazer a pergunta? So, George, what I was trying to talk about was that when we talk about queer theory, it seems like we are talking about LGBTQ plus therapy, right? Which is really not what it is about. But sometimes it seems like it sounds like it is about LGBTQ plus therapy in psychology. But it is really not the case, right? The theory speaks of all experiences. And what it does is rethink these experiences in light of hegemony. So what my question is how can we deepen this critique in depth psychology, which in my view is not really about replacing concepts, really, but about rethinking the way that we understand these concepts and how they are culturally influenced by binarisms and other kinds of hegemonies, right? Is that clear?
So, sort of, yes. So queer theory, I mean, I think, at the very beginning, I sort of said that actually what I'm trying to talk about is informed by queer theory, but queer theory is not at the center of what I'm doing exactly, really. I think it's very useful. And as you say, queer theory does a lot of useful things. And it is about questioning hegemony, exactly as you put it, really. And this is why I think it's related to individuation and adaptation, really. Now, in terms of the concepts and I don't know, I'm not sure. I think that there will be times that concepts need to be replaced, or concepts need to be deepened, or concepts are really useful sometimes for queers as well, for queer experience, actually. So I'm not so sure that it's one thing that we need to do. I think there's a lot of different things that we need to do. Sometimes we have to change what depth psychology says. Depth psychology has to adjust, in my view, to the 21st century, into queer experience. Sometimes it's, it's already there. It's already very clear. I think I kind of try to point out various moments at which Jung is very queer, actually, in my view. So I'm not sure, and you're also saying, you're making a distinction between queer theory and LGBTQ therapy. So really, I'm kind of trying to speak to both of these things, really, in a way. The queer theory is not the center of what I'm doing, but it informs what I'm doing. I'm talking about a queer Jungian sort of approach, really. That's what I'm trying to do. Something that takes into account queer experience and queer subjectivity, is informed by queer theory and uses Jungian sort of depth psychological sort of concepts. I'm not sure whether that answers your question, to be honest, but
it does. Thank you.
Okay, and then the final question about contemporary individuation and accepting the other, could that be rephrased? Is that possible to get a better understanding of it?
Eu posso reler.
É o André, né?
Mas se o André quiser fazer, seria bacana,
então,
André.
Meninas, qual que é o golpe, tá? Hoje
Cara,
vocês sabem, muito
cara,
obrigada aí pelas felicitações,
cara.
amo vocês.
Fecha aí.
Vou tentar fechar. Seria...
I'm not hearing the English.
Vou fazer novamente, então, a pergunta. Tá bom. Gostaria de perguntar sobre como a sociedade contemporânea pode se posicionar em relação à individuação, entendendo a psicologia junguiana como propulsora do pensamento ideológico de aceitação do outro.
So is this question about sort of, if you like, spreading the word or spreading the news, spreading, like the word of Jesus, if you like, spreading the word of Jung in a way? Is that what this question is? That actually, how can we tell contemporary society, hey, Jung has something interesting to offer? I wonder if I'm understanding the question. Yeah, okay. So that's okay. I'm gonna answer what I think I understand from the question. I mean, I suppose there is a place for us who understand Jungian psychology to spread it, to talk to people about it, and I do think it's a really useful sort of thing to share with the world, really. And I take enormous joy from bringing it to the university context in particular. But I also think that if we try to present Jungian ideas as this uncomplicated, straightforwardly positive contribution that and if we are defensive, when it comes to the obvious critiques that contemporary people are going to make, then I don't think I'm not for that really at all. So my kind of way of thinking about this is always that, what I do in my teaching at university is that I always try, almost in English we say in the same breath, almost in the same sentence that I'm going to say something really positive about Jung, I'm also going to acknowledge the ways in which Jung is problematic and unhelpful. so I don't think there's any point in trying to sort of try to defend, Jung from critiques, really, I think it's a very black and white way of thinking, that we either criticize Jung and we put him in the bin, or we treat him as this kind of saint, really, who could do no wrong. I mean, I think there's few people who are behaving in these ways, but I think the much more difficult task is to sit with the fact that this guy was both genius and sometimes a bit stupid. I think he even said, one of my favorite things he's ever said is that he was challenged by a Jewish friend of his about something that he said that was prejudiced. And his response was, well, I've published a lot of things, and some of these things are nonsense. Not everything is going to be, and of course, if you're a human being, I am sure that when I watch back my talk today and the way I've answered the questions, I'm sure that I would find ways in which I've said something really profound, as well as something stupid. I'm pretty sure, I guarantee that. Well, Jung is the same, really. And if we act as if, he was perfect, it's just not realistic, and Jungian psychology is not going to survive, really. And if it just does that, I don't think it does just that. But if it does just that, then it's not going to survive, really. I hope what I'm saying is relevant to the question, but I'm not 100% sure.
Jorge, temos duas perguntas. Podemos fazê-la em sequência? Então, vamos lá. Cris, Viana, e depois Lili, tá? Carmen Lívia.
Boa noite, Jorge. Obrigada. Estava ansiosa pela sua palestra. Espero que seu livro saia em breve, né? Vou falar um pouquinho da onde eu falo. Mais do que uma ativista feminista, eu sou uma militante, né, de esquerda, progressista, né? A estrela vermelha, como você brincou, né? E desde muito jovem, desde os 14 anos. Então, não consigo imaginar uma individuação fora da comunidade. Para mim, isso é uma coisa impensável, assim, né? E quando você estava falando, eu estava pensando se a gente poderia pensar em dividir um pouco o que é massa e o que é comunidade, né? A massa como essa coisa que é arrebatada, e a comunidade como um lugar de reflexão, de cuidado. E claro que a gente sabe que não vão ser coisas estanques, na massa também vão ter cuidados, vão ter momentos, e na comunidade também, né? A gente sabe que também não é um lugar perfeito e idílico, né? Então, eu queria pensar um pouquinho junto com você sobre isso, assim. Porque, como o Marcos falou, a gente tem algumas pessoas da comunidade junguiana aqui no Brasil, que qualquer coisa que se fale fora da cartilha junguiana é rechaçado. Então, essa questão, né, da massa como algo prejudicial para a individuação é muito repetida ainda por um grupo, né? Então, queria que você falasse um pouquinho assim, sobre isso. Obrigada.
Legal, Cris. Eli?
Oi, Jorge. Hoje a gente tem um grupo, a gente está te lendo, né? Como você sabe. Então, queria aproveitar para levantar aqui uma questão, né? Que é uma coisa que eu tenho pensado, que a gente pensou muito no curso ano passado, né? Que é assim, a gente tem falado muito da identidade masculina, identidade homem, né? Assim, e o quanto essa categoria, né, de alguma forma, tem sido repensada, alargada, revista, reimaginada, né? O que eu fico aqui pensando é a serviço de que está isso, né? Se isso de fato promoveria alguma transformação mais efetiva, ou se isso reforça uma categoria de uma identidade ainda muito pautada no colonialismo, né? Assim, se a gente não estaria só alargando para fazer caber, né? Alargando para reforçar, né? Ou se isso teria um potencial transformador de alguma forma, né? Então, eu queria te ouvir nesse sentido, né? Se existem masculinidades saudáveis, talvez.
Okay. These are, yes, this is both extremely interesting questions. I'm going to start with Chris, my comrade, who also likes the Red Star. So, you know, just to, I suppose to clarify that actually, if we take Jung at his word, he does not say that individuation is without community, of course, but he has a very particular sort of idea. And I think you're right, absolutely right, to make a distinction between what he referred to as the mass and what we might mean by community. I don't think that, for me at least, what is referred to as the mass doesn't always have negative connotations. And as you said, you know, there's a lot of care in the mass, you know, and all the rest of it. You know, I'll never forget, one of my favorite memories, you know, was protesting in Genova in 2001, I think. And, you know, the local residents, it was hot. We were protesting in the street. All the shops were shut because the police has shut everything down. And we were protesting against the G8 summit there. And the residents from the balconies were throwing water. If that's not a spiritual moment, a transcendent moment, I don't know what is really, you know. So absolutely, as you say. And also you know, when I was reading Jung talking about the mass, I was wondering if only he could experience what it's like to be in a protest, for example, right? What it's like to, and again, this is not for everybody. This is not everybody's individuation path. If it's not yours, then it isn't. But it happens to be mine, and I think it does, you know, it is worth thinking about, actually, you know, that actually the feeling of joining other people in a common cause is, you know, is remarkable, and it is transcendent, and it is spiritual, you know. As you say, community has more these kind of connotations of reflection, of a space, of a place where you go and you feel safe. It's not always safe, of course, you know, there's problems always, there's repetition of oppressive kind of dynamics also in community. But, you know, so I think, I suppose my response to you is, you know, yes, sometimes, I mean, the mass that has negative connotations, of course, is well, I mean, you know, what happened with the rise of the Nazis, you know, or the mass that, well, actually, the mass that stormed was it the White House in Washington, and then also the you know, in Brasilia as well, in Brazil after the election of Lula, right? So that mass that is a kind of mob that is, you know, thoughtless, you know, of course, you know, you might say that's a group I don't agree with. Yes, there is. But that's, to me, that's the negative kind of mass, a thoughtless kind of thing. My experience of being part of mass movements has not been thoughtless. Of course, it had thoughtlessness in it sometimes, but my experience on the whole was not thoughtless, actually. And it was about, you know, developing, encountering the other, you know, all of these things that Jung talks about in terms of individuation, of course, you know, yeah. So yeah, thank you for this. And I think if we want to keep the Jungian community restricted to an elite, then we don't need to look at any of this. But actually, the world is changing in a way that we're all worried about the planet. You know, these things are urgent. This is not that, it's almost like there's little time to debate. We need to take some action, actually. And yeah, if some people want to feel that that's not Jungian enough, that's okay. I mean, yeah, it's not okay by me, but you know, they're free to do what they need to do. Okay, the next really important question about masculinity, and again, you know, this is such a huge area, really. And I am always skeptical about these attempts to rethink masculinity, etc., etc., with some exceptions, right? So this idea of creating men's spaces, they haven't spoken to me. Maybe it's because my own sort of relationship to my gender is not, You know, I don't, like some non-binary people, even though I don't identify as non-binary myself, but like some non-binary people, the idea of me being a man doesn't sit 100% comfortably. And therefore, this idea of masculinity I have problems with, you know. And I think we might need to wait a long time for that to be rethought in a different way. I also think there's space for us to for everybody really to consider whether it's necessary at all. To, you know, I think one of the points I was making in Sao Paulo in the conference was that, you know, really masculinity and femininity, what are they? They are these labels that they are just collections of characteristics. You know, we know now that you can be sensitive, which usually is associated with femininity, and be the one who's penetrating, you know, which usually is associated with masculinity. You know, we know all of that. So, you know, nevertheless, there is an exception to this, I think, for me, which is particularly when trans people want to claim and assert their masculinity. So a trans masc person asserting, you know, and there I am open to whatever they mean. I mean, I'm open to anybody's thinking in terms of what is masculinity to them, and I'm open to hearing it, but I have all these objections that are saying, what is it, and how can we? I'll tell you an anecdote from a festival last year where it was a kind of very spiritual kind of place, a festival for Buddhists, and, you know, very beautiful place. It's called the Buddha Film Festival. Recommended if you're ever in the UK and you can make it. And there was a section of it that was, there was always a women's area, which, you know, it makes perfect sense to me, you know, and you know, and then there was then a men's area was created, and I never quite understood, and I spent a tiny bit of time with them, and I couldn't quite see what is the point, you know, of creating a space for this gender that has been idealized by patriarchy. I'm not sure, you know, perhaps it is about connecting with it in different ways. I have a good friend and colleague who is thinking about these things from a non-binary perspective, and I'm really open to listening to it. But I personally often feel uncomfortable with these spaces. And I saw this leaflet that was about yoga specifically for the area of men in this festival, and it said it was for men, and it was no frills yoga. So it was basically, you know, very straightforward yoga. And I'm thinking, okay, is this so? Okay, so we're back to something really basic in terms of what is masculinity, actually. Of course, there can be other ways of looking at it. And of course, I don't think that the characteristics that are usually associated with masculinity are necessarily bad. So penetrating is not, I don't think that penetrating is bad. I don't think that logic is, which usually is associated with masculinity, is bad. I don't think fighting and aggression is bad, but I don't need to put them under the masculine sort of label personally. But I'm open. I'm here, and I'm everywhere to not just to talk, but to listen as well. So this is how I feel about it, really. But yeah, it's a really important question, and these are the kinds of things that we're all grappling with, actually. You know, when a trans patient comes in and says, maybe I'm non-binary, or maybe I'm a trans man, I don't know. What does it mean? What the hell does it mean? I don't think that we can answer this question again, and this is where Jung is very useful. I don't think we can answer this question in a rationalistic way. I think we just have to listen to the unconscious, what it says, actually. For some people, it means something, this masculinity and being a man. I think that's it. I'm just aware there's another raised hand.
Vamos fazer a última pergunta, Sônia, por favor.
Boa noite, muito obrigada pela palestra, foi muito interessante. Não é uma pergunta, é só uma informação. Existe uma ONG em São Francisco que lida basicamente com substâncias psicodélicas, e e ela organizou, há 2 anos atrás, um congresso que chamava Queer Psychedelics, e agora, daqui a alguns dias, vai haver a segunda Conference Psychedelics. E então, quem tiver interessado, eu coloquei no chat o endereço. Para os brasileiros é mais fácil escrever mesmo chacruna.net, que vai direto para o site nos Estados Unidos, porque essa ONG tem o que eles chamam de Chacruna Latinoamérica. Então, se você simplesmente escrever Chacruna, vai sair nesse Latinoamérica, mas é a mesma ONG. E é uma antropóloga que é filha de 2 psicólogos e casada com uma psicóloga. Então, acho que tem muito a ver com psicologia também. Era isso. Obrigada.
But just to quickly say that I think this is very interesting, and I'm quite I'm quite interested in the intersection between queerness and psychedelics. And there is this kind of what is contained in the Red Book is not only queer, is not only very conducive to queerness, it also is very conducive to psychedelics and use of psychedelics, actually. And the 3 together, I think, are kind of very interesting. But you're also reminding me that I need to advertise something here to this group, which is that if you identify as queer and you are interested in Jung, there is a place for you. We have created the Queer Union Initiative, and if you are interested in it, I will put the email address in the chat, but it's basically queerunion@gmail.com. And everybody's welcome. You can just join the notice board, just get information basically, or you can join our monthly meetings that we have once a month, where we share dreams, and we also talk about, we have various different either creative or academic sort of papers. Yeah, and you're very, very welcome. And we also have some kind of deal with subtitles, so that if you don't speak English, some people who are here are using that sort of function. And yeah, so I would love to see more of you in that group.
Jorge, só para dizer que eu fiz essa propaganda porque a criadora do site é minha filha, a Bia Labate.
Okay, that's good to know. Fantastic.
Jorge, vou te fazer a última pergunta para a gente fechar, tá? A questão trans na França, particularmente entre os lacanianos, é alvo de interesse há mais de 10, 15 anos. Eu não sei muito bem se você podia me atualizar ou não, mas me parece que talvez seja a comunidade psicanalítica que mais se debruça sobre o tema. Alguns anos atrás, um famoso lacaniano, Jacques Alain Miller, cunhou a expressão epidemia trans, que causou um alvoroço na comunidade, enfim. Foi até tema de uma famosa revista brasileira aqui, Cult, com o mesmo título, discutindo e problematizando essa expressão. Numa série de publicações que foram feitas após essa declaração dele, ele traz uma frase, que é uma frase que sempre ficou enigmática para mim, que é a seguinte: ele diz que, para a psicanálise, o que aparece na clínica, no sujeito trans, é a singularidade, e não a bandeira. Essa é uma frase muito enigmática para mim. Queria dividir contigo, saber o que você entende dessa frase, de que, para a psicanálise, o que aparece no dia a dia da clínica, ou na sua particularidade, é a singularidade do sujeito e não a bandeira. Eu estou da bandeira como uma espécie de estandarte político, identitário. Faz sentido? Você acha que é uma frase conservadora? O que você acha da expressão epidemia trans? Queria te ouvir um pouco.
I mean, thank you, Marcus. This is so interesting. I wasn't familiar with all of this. Well, I want to say two things really, because I'm also aware of the time. But so the whole idea of a trans epidemic is really problematic, of course, because it implies that it's a virus. It implies that it's something negative. But trans is okay. Trans is fine. It's not a bad outcome if somebody is trans. It only reveals the prejudice if you refer to it as an epidemic. Are people inspired to come out as trans because they see other people who are trans? Well, of course. I didn't feel comfortable to come out as queer when I grew up in a country that was suppressing queerness. As soon as I am surrounded by queer people, I am much more able to proclaim my queerness and actually proclaim it with a flag as well. Now, and that leads me to the second sort of issue about the flag versus the individual. Well, this is where Jung is helpful again, because in a way, what is the distinction between the flag and the individual? Maybe, of course, there are situations where there is a massive distinction, where, say, somebody is queer or is gay or lesbian or whatever, or trans, and doesn't feel connected to their community, and therefore they are talking about themselves not as part of that community. I can see that, and that's not a problem with me at all. But the thing that psychoanalysis and Jungian analysis and Lacanian analysis often struggle with is that, just like Winnicott says there is no such thing as a baby, Winnicott says there's no such thing as a baby, and this has become a famous expression because basically you cannot just think of the baby by herself. There is always a nursing couple, Winnicott says. Well, similarly, there isn't such a thing in a way as patient and analyst, because there is this interconnection between the two. But also there isn't such a thing as just an individual, just like there isn't such a thing as if you're just social, where are you basically? I don't think you're very happy if you're just social and nothing else. But also, I think it's a trick, this expression, that in the consulting room you have. Yes, for some people that is true, but I also think it's important to remember that we are all part of interconnected whole. I think the pandemic also reminded us that. The pandemic reminded us that we are all dependent on each other. We are not isolated. No matter how isolated we were, no matter how forcibly isolated we were, it was a reminder that we impact on each other. We are interconnected. It's an illusion to think of us as separate individuals and as just separate individuals. That's my opinion on it.
Ótimo. Jorge, obrigado. Obrigado. Queria te agradecer a tua gentileza, você ter aceito o nosso convite. Você é sempre muito afetivo, muito claro, muito didático na sua apresentação e sempre deixando 1000 questões em aberto. Espero que você possa voltar em breve com o teu livro para a gente continuar essa conversa. O convite já está feito antecipadamente. Muito obrigado.
Thank you. I must go and write the book. Okay, thank you so much. I'm so grateful for all of your support and your interest in what I have to offer. Really, it's a joy to be with you.
Na próxima visita ao Rio, me avisa, hein? Tá bom? Pessoal,
Yes.
Obrigado pela presença. Mais um Tiaços. A gente volta, Lu, quando é que é?
Dia 28 de abril, com um palestrante que se chama Marcos Quintais,
O próximo sou eu.
que vai falar do sujeito ciumento, a vida enciumada, quando a flecha preta do ciúme se torna um complexo.
Então tá. Gente, bom fim de tarde, bom final de semana. Até a próxima.
Até a próxima.
Obrigado, Isa.